live from the Peterson Tech campus of the Westbrook Walnut Grove High School. I'm your host, Wendy Rogatsky. Yesterday, we stopped at the Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum in Walnut Grove and selected a lot of new reading material. We did have a few technical issues yesterday. I think one of the wagon wheels was broken. We visited with author William Anderson, one of the elders of Laura Research. With our wheels back on the wagon, we thought it would be nice to visit some of the younger Wilder authors and presenters. We sent out telegrams, and faster than the Pony Express, we got a response. Melanie Stringer sent a courier with her note. She is an interdisciplinary public historian, museum specialist, and owner of Meet Laura Ingalls Wilder, LLC, presenting over 250 living history programs in 9 states since 2010. Wendy McClure got in touch with us by carrier pigeon. She is a columnist, book editor, and author of Wilder Life, My Adventure in the Lost World of Little House on the Prairie.
Hello.
Please welcome Wendy McClure and Melanie Stringer.
Hello. Hi.
Hello. Melanie, what started your passion for history and Laura Ingalls Wilder?
Well, if you can believe it, I learned how to read by reading Laura's books. Quite literally, like sitting on my dad's lap, and he would take my finger and parse out one syllable at a time. And by the time I was in my early teens, I was bugging a very patient librarian, asking questions about why the books were considered children's historical fiction instead of autobiography. And she took me to the stacks in the library and pulled out a bunch of titles that were published in the 1920s and 30s, so a little earlier and then contemporaneous with when Laura was writing her books. And the books that she selected for me were titles that talked about traveling on the Oregon Trail and westward expansion, and they were mostly, diaries and letters that people had kept when they were on these trails, around Laura's time or a little before her. And she was teaching me about the difference in genre from, something that's a first-person account versus something that is researched and then edited and compiled. And before I knew it, I just was eating up anything I could find like that, and it has not stopped in all these decades since. So it's just something that's always been a driving force, is understanding the context and wanting to know more of the fuller story, what's really going on in the world around Laura, not just in her family, but in the places that she's at and in the wider world around her, whether it's, politics, religion, different interesting pieces of the geography and, why are people moving so much? All of those things have just really driven me for many, many years.
Okay. Wendy, your book title refers to the lost world of Little House. How did you come up with that title?
I think we wanted to get across the idea that the world of the books was something I really wanted to get back into. My story is I read the books as a kid. I never actually owned them. I always just had copies from the library. And although I memorized where the books were in the library, and, I could trace my steps and find out where, the where hardcovers were, and then also find them on the paperback racks. And then, so because I didn't have, a set, I wasn't one of those kids who reread the books every year. I didn't read them again for decades. And then when I did rediscover them, and I think I came across the first book I had, I think I just had one copy of Little House in the Big Woods, and that I had unearthed after many years, and I read it. And then my husband brought home the box set. And so, it just really kind of hit me right away. Like, I want to go to the world of the books. And it was kind of like the idea that I was visiting Narnia or Oz, but, it fascinated me. I could go there. I mean, when I was a kid, I always kind of hoped that on camping trips my parents might, drive by the log cabin or something, in Kansas, because we did drive through Kansas on one, family vacation. But it never occurred to me that you could actually go there. For some reason, I never thought to ask my parents, if we could go to Walnut Grove or, anything like that. So then as an adult, I thought, wow, I have a car, I have money, I can go to these places. And so the sense of it sort of being, this world from my childhood sort of opened again. And so that's what I wanted to get across in the title. And I mean, and then when I, visited all, Walnut Grove and all these places, I was so amazed that the world was there, and sort of just as I remembered from the books.
Okay. So this question is for both of you. What continues to fascinate and drive you to follow and research Laura Ingalls Wilder?
Well, for me, I think it's interesting how, with all the books that have been published about Laura, there's still so much that we don't know. And that missing information is what I'm always on the quest for. Just finding out more of the story, especially the years that are particularly thin in information. The probably 2 decades or so leading up to Laura actually publishing the books, we don't know a whole lot other than her journalism career. We don't really know a lot of the nitty-gritty details, and especially we don't know very much at all about Rose's childhood. So at least we know myth, we don't know a whole lot of fact. So that always fascinates me, that there's just so much missing. So,
Wendy, how about you?
I really like seeing how the larger world encounters the Little House books and how that relationship has changed over the years. I think, it seems like different generations and even different cultures get different things out of the books. And I love sort of seeing, how that works. I always want to know more about how people in Japan relate to Laura Ingalls Wilder ever since they were introduced to their books after World War II. I think that is such a cool story. And, what is it about the books that, made them, fall in love with them? And I think the books tell us a lot about our own country. Not just, the 1870s, but the Great Depression, and even during the 1970s when the TV show came out. And there's so many cool facets, and I really love that.
Okay. Throughout your research, were there any events or information that surprised you or was unexpected? Wendy, we can start with you this time.
Well, yeah, I mean, my research was really more just sort of experiencing things from the books and traveling places. So one of the experiences, I had no idea that churning butter doesn't take hours and hours, because there was something about that, the way that scene in Little House in the Big Woods is written, where, well, Ma was churning, but sometimes when she was tired, she let Mary have a turn. I'm like, oh, this must take a long time. And so the first time I got a crock and dash churn and churned butter and realized it didn't take long at all. So that was unexpected. So things like that. I didn't expect it would be so hard to get my hands on a green pumpkin to make the long winter pie. When you don't have a pumpkin patch, for some reason, I thought, you could go to the store and get a green pumpkin, but it turns out you actually have to sort of really hit up a guy at the farmer's market and, ask him to bring you one the next week. So stuff like that. All that stuff was new and kind of a surprise. And, and so it was really fun finding all that stuff out.
Melanie?
So one of the things that absolutely bowled me over was when I decided that I was going to present living history as an adult but not yet famous Laura. Very early on in that research, I discovered that Laura's paternal great-grandfather, so Charles's father's father, was born in Sandown, New Hampshire. I'm a native and a lifelong resident of New Hampshire. Sandown is about 20 minutes from where I did most of my K through 12 schooling. And that just really messed with me because as it turns out, I had also gone to college in the foothills of the White Mountains. And when that same great-grandfather of hers was a young man, he was living in the town next to the town where I had gone to college. And I have this tendency to do what I call checking out old cemeteries. Ancient cemeteries are a thing of mine. And when I was first in college, I had my first car. Whenever I just needed to take a break from things, I would get in the car and I'd seek out an old cemetery. And I actually found cemeteries that had the Ingalls surname in them. So then all these years later, I decide I'm going to do this, and I find this out about Samuel Worthen Ingalls being born in my state. And I was on a quest, and I'm like, oh, where were those cemeteries where I used to see the Ingalls name all the time? So that is something that actually led to the monograph that I'm working on now, where I'm discussing the history of the first 8 generations of the Ingalls family from the time they landed in America to the time that Charles was born in Western New York.
That's fascinating. Wendy,
yeah.
Has anything about the quarantine felt particularly Little House to you?
A little bit. I mean, maybe less so now that it's summer, but in the first few months, I was trying to bake some bread, and then that sort of sense of having to go grocery shopping, only once in a great while, and trying to sort of be resourceful and make things last. And I found myself sort of thinking, like, what would Ma do? Would Ma throw out this lettuce? What would But so it was a lot. I think a lot of the cooking stuff, especially, felt very, very Little House. Yes.
So, Melanie, Laura Ingalls Wilder's writings have been criticized for being culturally insensitive. What is your perspective about these concerns?
I think they're very legitimate, and I think it's important that folks recognize this, and that we understand that there are a lot of things in the books that were painful for people to read, even when the books were being published. And when I say that, I'm not attacking Laura. I think it's important for people to understand, too, we can love somebody, but not love everything about them. And in her work, there are times when she uses slurs. And these were slurs even when she was writing. But as a white woman in a rural area, it might not have been in her knowledge base to understand that these were slurs or why they were slurs. But there were certainly Native Americans and African Americans who were very outspoken about this. People like W.E.B. Du Bois. The Oneida Nation in upstate New York had made statements about these sorts of pieces of language, not specifically about Laura, but about some of the terms that show up in her books. So I think it's important when you look at the context of her work to understand that although some people, like Laura, might have used those words, it doesn't mean that they were acceptable at that time. It means that not everybody was aware of what Native American culture and African American culture, what they found acceptable at all. And I think even today we have a hard time sometimes stepping out of our own perspectives. And, as a white woman, obviously I realize, I'm saying this knowing that I probably grew up with a lot of very questionable notions that I've had to unlearn myself. So I think it's very important that we pay attention to this, and that we don't just chalk it up to, oh, well, that's how everybody talked back then, because it certainly isn't how everybody talked back then. It's how some people who were not as aware were speaking, and the portrayals as well. There's a lot of mythology. There's a lot of pieces of information that, if you were a white person in rural America, you were hearing different things than if you were perhaps Osage, or if you were Ojibwe, or if you were Lakota. So I think we just have to acknowledge that and try a little harder, maybe a lot harder, to understand those contexts. There's a great resource through Minnesota, actually, through the Minnesota Historical Society, and it's called the Absent Narratives Project. And for anybody who's interested in learning more about how we can unpack a lot of that really problematic material, the Absent Narratives Project is a good resource for that.
Okay. Since we're talking about other works and writers, how would you compare Wilder's writings to those other writers and works? And would you recommend any of them for those who enjoy her works?
I do have one recommendation, and actually I feel like it dovetails nicely with everything Melanie was talking about. I think Melanie's points were wonderful about the cultural, insensitivity issue. And I think, listening, seeing the other side. And a book came out recently called Prairie Lotus by Linda Sue Park. I have a copy here. It's probably going to show up backwards if I hold it up. I don't know how that works, but it's a middle grade novel, and it is it's kind of in conversation with the Little House books, and it's about a Chinese American girl who moves to a South Dakota town that is much like De Smet in around 1880. So it's sort of imagining, what a place like the little town, the Prairie, would have been to a girl who would have been seen as very different in that time and place. And it's for readers age 8 and up, but I think anyone who is a fan of the books would enjoy it as an adult. I think she really, gets into that sort of same sense of place, and also how things are made. I mean, Linda Sue Park is, she grew up loving the books, and it shows. That's one huge recommendation. How about you, Melanie? Do you have anything you'd recommend?
Well, as a museum specialist, the work of Amy Lonetree, I think, is extremely important. She is Native American and a museum specialist, and she has written extensively about how to decolonize museums and how to tell Native American stories using Native American scholars and highlighting their work and highlighting things. So, for example, in Laura's books, there's references to the Minnesota Massacre. And if you look at it from the perspective of anyone who was involved in that, who is Native American, they're going to look at it as this is a war. It's not one-sided at all. The losses were pretty much equal on the two sides of that conflict. And talking about that in real terms, real numbers, using data to back up your information, and kind of talk back to the narrative that is very white-centered and that has been told over and over and over again for more than 100 years in museums and in history institutions. So Amy Lonetree is definitely somebody to take a lot of notice of and follow some of her advice.
Well, in continuing along that same line, we cannot speak of Wilder's works without considering other works that it has inspired, including movies, plays, and television series. What value do they add or detract from the messages that she sought to convey?
Well, this is something that's always interested me, is, again, like what I was saying before about, I feel like every generation, every culture sort of brings its own relationship to the Little House books. And so, for instance, there is an adaptation of The Long Winter for radio during, that, came out in the 1940s. And, when you listen to that, there's all kinds of subtext about, World War II. And, the way they interpreted The Long Winter is really interesting, because I think it's Pa who goes out to get the wheat, and, sort of echoing, all these, fathers who are going off to fight overseas, and, and just this, when you listen to it, like, oh, this is about World War II. It's The Long Winter, but, this is what it's about. And I think for the same reason, I think there's a lot in the TV show, Little House on the Prairie, the 1974 show, that really speaks to the 70s and 80s. I mean, I think that was a show about the 70s, in a lot of ways that, I think sort of took on these, sort of issues of, mom going back to work, or, integration in our neighborhood in a really friendly way. So, I kind of, that's another thing that I love about the Ingalls Wilder and the Little House books, is that, it just keeps expanding in terms of, sort of cultural meanings.
Melanie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm a historian, but full disclosure, I would not be here if it weren't for the TV show. That show was on TV when I was just a baby, and my mom was watching it. And she was fascinated with the interplay between Mrs. Ingalls and Mrs. Olson. She thought they were hilarious. And so she started having me watch the show. And one day my parents noticed that the show was based on this series of books, because my parents had never heard of these books at all. They grew up in the East, and they didn't have any relationship to the Midwest. And the books, there's a lot of difference in the East versus the Midwest as far as how well people know who Laura is. Out here, I've had a lot of people say, who? And then if I say Little House on the Prairie, they're like, oh, yes, of course I know, But if I say Laura Ingalls Wilder, they don't always know who I'm talking about. And so the reason I got those books as a very small child was because my parents were watching the TV show, and they just noticed that credit line that there was a series of books. And so I have to thank the show for being really entertaining, and all the people that are on the show that made it so much fun to watch. And there's a lot of anachronisms, and there's a lot of, kitschy, because it is very 70s. It's a very 70s show. Yes. But to this day, people watch it and they're engaged. And a lot of times they ask questions. I get questions every single time I present. I get questions about how much of the show is real. Yes. And people want to know more.
Yes,
so I think it brings people to history. It brings people to her books.
It's a great introduction.
That is very true. Our time is rounding up, so I'd like to thank both you, Melanie and Wendy, for being our guests this evening. Mrs. Fitch said she would tell us about her chickens and give us some fresh eggs today if we helped her feed and pick eggs. You can both come along to help. Any last thoughts or a favorite Laura quote before you help us bring in some firewood?
Whenever I'm a little bit upset and frustrated, especially in the last few months, I always have to remind myself swearing is such a foolish habit.
Well, I think about Laura when Manley gave her a newfangled butter churn that she didn't like at all. She wanted her old Crock and Dash churn. And finally, her solution to this newfangled churn is she went out the back door and she said she dropped it just as far as she could.
Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care.